So in this lesson, we're going to be discussing the quartal chord voicing, which is essentially just building up a chord in intervals of fourths rather than thirds. Now today, playing a chord built up only in intervals of thirds, that is just stacked thirds, is considered rather old-fashioned and simplistic. Whereas building up a chord in intervals of fourths is considered much more sophisticated and produces a much more modern sound. Now, chords built up in fourths are much more ambiguous and they have a very suspended or sus chord feel, which means they don't really sound like they want to resolve anywhere. They kind of just float there. Right, that chord doesn't really feel like it needs to go anywhere in the way that a dominant chord built up in thirds really wants to go and resolve to the tonic. And as I just mentioned, a quartal chord is very ambiguous and it can be a number of different chords at once. And I'll go through what some of those chords are in a bit. So now, even though we're building up a chord in intervals of fourths, we can still analyze that chord like any other regular chord, just using sort of our standard harmony and sort of theory. Now, the standard quartal chord voicing consists of 5 notes. However, this can be dropped down to 4 or even 3 or increased to 6. And generally, quartal chords are played sort of in the middle register of the piano. If they get too low, they get a bit muddy, or too high, they get sort of a bit weak and a bit sort of twinkly. Now, to show you this ambiguity, let's build up a quartal chord beginning on the note E and just going up in intervals of perfect fourths. So we go E, A, D, G, C. Now, this chord can be a C6-9, F major 13, A minor 11, D sus 9, or B flat major 13 sharp 11. And that's what I mean when I say that quartal chords are ambiguous. This one chord, because of the way that it's structured, the suspended feel that it gives, and the notes that it's using, it can be each of these 5 chords depending on context. So depending on the preceding and the following chords and the sort of the key that you're in. Now, the other interesting thing to note about a 5-note quartal chord voicing, like we have here, is that if we play the first inversion of this chord, so we take the bass note and we move it up to the top, we have a so what chord voicing. And I've got a completely separate lesson on so what chord voicings, and so in effect they're really the same chord, just one's an inversion of the other. So everything I said in the so what chord lesson is applicable here as well, just one inversion down. Now, even though there is this sort of ambiguity around quartal chord voicings, there are still a few sort of generic or widely used quartal voicings, which I'll go through now. And so there are 2 major, 1 minor, and 2 dominant generic quartal chord voicings. Now, if we stick to the key of C major, our sort of generic chord voicings are as follows. Our 2 major ones are this, which is a C6-9 with a root at the top. Then if we get rid of the root and play the B down the bottom, we have a C major 9 with a 5th on top. Our generic minor quartal chord voicing looks like this. So that's a D minor 11 with the 3rd on top. And then our 2 generic dominant chords look like this. The first one is a G9, and it looks like that. And our second one is a G13, and it looks like this. Now, the only thing to note is that the dominant generic quartal chord voicings are not built exclusively out of intervals of perfect fourths. If we have a look, for example, at the first one, this one here, B, F, A, D, G, we see that this interval is not a perfect fourth, is actually a tritone, and this interval here is not a perfect fourth, it's actually a major 3rd. However, this is still considered a quartal chord voicing because we're sort of cheating a little bit. The tritone is actually an augmented fourth, and the major 3rd is actually a diminished fourth. So the perfect fourth, but down a semitone. So in that sense, it's still a quartal chord voicing, even though we're augmenting and diminishing, that is, slightly increasing and decreasing the interval of a perfect fourth. And similarly, in the other dominant quartal chord voicing, we've got an interval of a tritone, again between the F and the B. Now, the other interesting thing to note about this sort of dominant quartal chord voicing is that the left hand always plays a tritone, that is, the third and the seventh, the B and the F. Now, we're going to encounter this again when we cover a chord voicing called an upper structure, which I will cover in my next lesson. But anyway, that's just something to look forward to. So now, if we were to play a 2-5-1 in the key of C major using these generic chord voicings, we could play something like this. Or, right, so that was just a 2-5-1 using the generic quartal chord voicings, and then another 2-5-1 using the other generic quartal chord voicings. Now, in the same way that we can walk up the diatonic scale, in this case in the key of C major, and create a chord built in thirds over each of the notes, so we have, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G7, and so on, we can do the same with quartal chords, that is, take each of the notes of the C major scale and build up chords in intervals of fourths, and then analyze those chords. And the only thing you really need to note is that the interval between the B and the F is a tritone, whereas the interval between all the other notes is a perfect fourth. Now, when analysing these quartal chord voicings, the most important thing that we have to pay attention to are the avoid notes. Now, if you don't know what they are, I've got a separate video on avoid notes, so you can go check that out. But essentially, the general rule is that when you're building quartal chord voicings, if you're using only notes from a particular key, for example in the key of C major, a quartal chord voicing can be any diatonic chord as long as it doesn't have that chord's avoid note. And while not strictly necessary, you get a stronger chord if you include the third and the seventh of that chord. Now, that's quite an abstract and convoluted rule, so it'll make more sense if I go through an example of what I mean. So let's, for example, take the chord C major 7. Now, from the point of view of the C major 7, the avoid note is the F. So what that rule essentially means is that any quartal chord voicing that uses only the notes from the C major scale, so only the white notes, and doesn't have the note F, is some kind of C chord. Like, for example, we were playing this chord earlier. So this uses only white notes, so only the notes from the C major scale, and it doesn't have the note F. Therefore, it's some kind of C chord. In this case, it's a C6-9. Whereas this chord, again, only using all the white notes, so that's fine, but it contains the note F, which is an avoid note from the point of view of C major 7. Therefore, it cannot be some kind of C major chord. And generally, you get a stronger sound if you include the third and the seventh of the chords, so that is the E and the B. So in this chord voicing, we've got the third, but we don't have the seventh. So even though it's a C6-9, it's not a particularly strong C major sound. Whereas this chord voicing, our second generic chord voicing, doesn't have the F. Again, there's no F in this chord voicing, so it is some kind of C major chord. And we've got the B and the E, the third and the seventh, so that's considered a stronger C major chord or sound. But of course, just because it's a stronger sound doesn't mean you should favour this chord voicing over this chord voicing. It's just something to keep in mind. The C6-9 is a perfectly fine chord to use. It's just considered theoretically not as strong as the C major 9 chord voicing here. So now let's quickly do the exercise of taking every note from the C major scale and building up a quartal chord from each of those notes, and then just quickly analysing it. And you can see the results here up in this picture-in-picture, but I'll sort of run through it quickly. Now I'm going to use 5-note quartal chords to do this exercise, but you could just as easily repeat it with 4-note and 6-note quartal chords. But essentially what that means is that because there are 7 notes in the C major scale, and we're playing 5-note quartal chords, that means we will always be missing 2 notes. And as you can see here in the picture-in-picture, I've listed those missing notes. So now let's take the first chord, starting from the E, building up in fourths. So this chord doesn't have the notes F and B. That means it can be some kind of C chord and some kind of A minor chord, because the avoid note is F for those chords. And it can also be some kind of D minor chord, because the avoid note for the D minor is the B. And so we have a C69, a D minor 11, an A minor 11, and an F major 13 from this chord voicing. Similarly, we can go up and analyze the next chord. The 2 missing notes here are G and C. So the missing notes are C, so that means it can be some kind of G7 chord and some kind of B half diminished chord. And in fact, we see it's a G13 and a B half diminished. It can also be an F major 7 sharp 11 and a D minor 6-9, which is a little bit different because we've got the B in there, so technically it shouldn't be a D minor chord, but it's in sort of altered D minor chord because it's a D minor 6-9. But anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside. So then you can sort of just keep going up and doing the same exercise. So starting on the note G, that'll give us a G7 sus and an F major 7 sharp 11. Starting on A gives us a D minor 11 and an F 6-9. On B we get a C major 13, E minor 11, B half diminished, and F major 13 sharp 11. And notice up here that the avoid notes for the chord E minor 7 are F and C, and this is the only chord voicing which misses both notes F and C. So this is the only possible chord voicing in the key of C major that gives us the chord E minor 11. Again, moving up, that gives us a, starting on the C, that gives us a G7 sus and an F major 7 sharp 11. And again, starting on the D, that gives us a G7 sus and an F major sharp 11 as well. And notice that the F major, or the 4 of the key of C major, has no avoid notes. So that means that every single one of these quartal chord voicings can be some kind of F major chord. However, as I noted earlier, it's generally considered to be a stronger chord voicing if you include the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. So F major, the 3rd is the A, and the 7th is the E. So then, for example, if we do this last one chord voicing here, starting on the D, notice that the 2 missing notes are the A and the E. So we're missing the 3rd and the 7th of the F major chord. So that means even though it technically is an F major chord, because F major has no avoid notes, it's not a particularly strong F major chord because we're missing that 3rd and the 7th. Whereas the one sort of a step down, beginning on the C, includes both the E and the A. So it's a much more stronger F major sound. But again, that doesn't mean you should favor one over the other necessarily. It's all a matter of taste. So now let's take these quartal chord voicings and insert them into a song to see how they sound. And let's take the standard Fly Me to the Moon. So that was Fly Me to the Moon using only quartal chord voicings, and I was using voicings that had the melody note on top. So for example, it started on the A minor 7 with a C in the melody, so I used this chord voicing. Then it moved down to the D minor 7 with the F in the melody, so I used this chord voicing. Then it went to a G7, and I wanted to use this chord voicing with a G at the top, so I waited till the melody got to that G, so it went. I waited till the melody got to the G, and then I played the chord voicing. And then I cheated a little bit on the C major 7 by playing a 4-note quartal chord voicing with the melody note on top, which is the E. And then so on through the whole song. So you can perform this same exercise with 4- and 6-note quartal voicings, but I'm not going to do that here. But I did want to make mention of one particularly widely used 6-note quartal voicing, and it's for a dominant chord, and you hear it often in blues, or especially at the beginning of a blues, and it looks and sounds like this. And that is a G13, so it's got the F, B, E, A, D, G. And so notice it's missing the note C, which is the avoid note from the point of view of the G7, so tick for that. And that's a particularly sort of rich and heavy and really nice sounding and really sort of full sounding G7 chord or G13 chord, which, like I said, is often used in blues. So that's more or less everything I wanted to cover in relation to quartal chords. So in conclusion, I suppose, the quartal and the so what chord voicings are considered very modern because they use largely intervals of fourths rather than thirds, and so they give a really sophisticated and nice and modern sound. Now in my next lesson I'm going to cover chord voicings called upper structures. And these 3 chord voicings together, quartal, so what, and upper structures, make up a lot of modern jazz piano and sound really smooth when they're sort of blended all together, so you can look forward to that. Otherwise, as always, feel free to leave any questions or comments, and thanks for watching. See you guys.